Ted Purchase, Bold Lens Photography, and today we are going to be taking a macro shot with nothing more than a kit lens and a entry-level micro four thirds camera. Now, the reason why I'm using this gear instead of some better gear is that I just want to prove and show to you guys that you can get great images with entry-level gear. Now, there's a big quotes when I said macro shot, because some people only consider a macro shot a macro if it is used with a one-to-one macro lens, and that's just simply arbitrary. But for full disclosure, yeah, this isn't going to get you the same kind of results that you would get with a good, true, dedicated macro lens. You're just going to be able to get a lot closer with those, and in general, a lot of the better macro lenses are known for their insane image quality, because macro is all about the best image quality. You want to get it as clean as you possibly can. That really is the trick. So if you're new to this series, this is my step-by-step photo series where I'm going to go through one step at a time and show you exactly from beginning to end, from setting up my equipment to going in the computer and post processing. I'm going to show you guys exactly how to get this shot. First, let's go ahead talk about the equipment that we're going to be using today. So this right here, this is just a an Olympus EM10 Mark II. You can get these for dirt cheap. You can get the EM10 Mark I for even less. There's been times where I've seen this lens in combo for less than 200 bucks. Usually, if you can't find a deal, you can find it at least 350 bucks or less for this lens in combo, and you get quite a bit of features out of it. And I have a lot of good shots with these. Just because it's so small and tiny, I use it for travel all the time. It's fantastic. This lens is just your basic kit lens. It's okay, but it's nothing crazy. It's not going to blow your mind in any ways, but it's a nice lens. It's actually pretty decent for a kit lens. I feel like I said in my last video, I kind of like the Nikon ones a little bit better when I shot Nikon, but this still does pretty good. And then we're also going to be using a tripod today. Now, normally for these series, I try to keep it as simple as possible and use the least amount of equipment that I possibly can, because a lot of beginners, they just don't have all this crazy equipment. I don't want them to go out and buy stuff just because, just to get a shot when you don't really need that equipment. But a tripod is something I would highly recommend for a beginner that wants to get into macro photography. The shot that we're going to go do, I could probably do it just fine without a tripod, but with macro, when you get really close, you get this razor thin, shallow depth of field, even stop down, even with a camera and lens like this. And what that's going to do is just any sort of slight movement can really throw you off. So a tripod is huge in helping out with that. It's just going to help you get the cleanest image that you possibly can. Once you really learn about your shutter speeds and what you can handhold, what you can't handhold at macro distances or with longer lenses and different focal lengths, for different types of photography. Once you learn that stuff, then there is a lot of this macro that you can do handheld. I even have some great macro shots that I've done with a real macro lens, hand holding at near 1:1 outside, and so that's pretty difficult to do, even with Olympus's stabilization, which is the best in the game. It's still difficult. So a tripod is huge for this. As far as the camera body goes, if you really do want to get to macro, I highly recommend getting Olympus or just even Panasonic, any micro four thirds camera. For one, shallow depth of field, or for one, you get a deeper depth of field with a smaller sensor. That is huge for this work. That's one of the biggest problems with macro, is you're always fighting this ultra razor thin shallow depth of field because you're focusing on something that is so close. Using the smaller sensor, it's a disadvantage for things like portraits where you want that shallow depth of field, but this is where it comes full circle, because it's actually a huge advantage, in my opinion, when shooting macro. On top of that, you get all the mirrorless goodies out of getting a mirrorless camera. So even if you don't go with Olympus or Panasonic for other reasons, definitely consider mirrorless in mind if you do want to do some macro. One of the biggest things is electronic shutter. What that's going to do is it's going to help you get rid of any handshake just to help you get the cleanest image possible. A lot of these mirrorless cameras also have fantastic IBIS. You know, really popular lens when I shot Nikon was the Tokina 100mm f2.8. Never used it myself, but it looked like a fantastic lens. I probably would have bought it if I was more into macro back then, and definitely would suggest it. I mean, it's really highly recommended by a lot of good photographers, but it doesn't have any stabilization. So if you put that on Nikon, you have no stabilization whatsoever. My 30mm macro lens that I have for Olympus, that doesn't have any stabilization, but it doesn't matter because I have it in body, and that's huge because even with stabilization, you really need a high shutter speed, because when you're super close, you got that really shallow depth of field, and you know, you'll see when we do it, any little tiny bit of shake can really throw your image off. So that's a big advantage. Of course, WYSIWYG, there's a whole bunch of other benefits to going mirrorless. Another massive benefit to going Olympus, and most brands do this, except for, I don't know if Canon does. I know Nikon, they just now put it in the D850, but I know most mirrorless brands do this. Olympus does, and that is focus bracketing. We're going to get in that in a later day, and what that does is it's going to do multiple pictures while moving your focus a little bit each time, depending on how you have it set up. It's awesome, so you can focus stack in post on your computer, and that will help you increase your depth of field. It's a technique that a lot of serious hardcore macro photographers use all the time. But what's also great about these is that they also have built-in focus stacking too. Not this camera, but if you do get the higher end Olympus cameras like the EM1 Mark II that I'm filming with right now, that can bracket and actually merge the shots in camera up to 9 shots. Pretty sure the Sonys can do it, and Panasonics as well, and maybe Fuji. I'm not sure. You guys would have to look that up, but those are two features that you should definitely be looking at if you want to get into macro. And you know, when you combine all those things together, I just can't think of a better system for macro than Micro Four Thirds myself. And even, you know, on top of that, the camera that I'm shooting with right now, you know, a lot of times it's still subjects on a tripod. That has an 80 megapixel high resolution mode. So if I just want to get crazy detail, I can go up to 80 megapixels with the camera that I'm filming with right now, which is awesome. But let's quit talking about gear. Let's get out there and start shooting. Okay guys, let's go ahead and take a look at our settings here really quick. So to start off, we're at ISO 200. We're shooting a still subject on a tripod, so there's no reason not to be at ISO 200, which is going to give us the cleanest image possible because it is the lowest native ISO that our camera can go. We have image stabilization off because we're on a tripod and we don't need it. And even though it usually doesn't cause any issues, because most modern systems will turn off their stabilization if you're on a tripod, just in case it doesn't, we have it off anyways. Not a big deal if you accidentally leave it on. Shooting RAW, of course, because RAW is going to let us play with our image, and if we need to, we can fix our exposure or bring out some of the dynamic range of the camera that we can't do with a JPEG. We can play with our colors more. It's just, in general, going to give us more flexibility in post. If you're not comfortable shooting RAW, then I suggest shooting RAW plus JPEG. That way you can go back to your RAW files later if you need to. Oops. And we are using a 2-second silent shutter. Now, the reason why we're doing a silent shutter is because nothing mechanical in the camera will move, so there won't be any sort of shake at all whatsoever. It's one of the huge advantages of mirrorless. The only DSLR with it is the D850, and we're doing 2 seconds because just even touching the camera a little bit can kind of shake it just to hit the shutter. So there's going to be a little 2-second delay. That way the camera has time to center, and it's going to get the absolute sharpest image that we can possibly get. Because when you're shooting macro, even just a kit lens with a cheap entry-level camera like this, image quality is huge. It's really what makes or break a macro picture compared to some other types of pictures out there. White balance is auto. Since we're shooting RAW, we can always change that in post if it's off. It should be fine. Most modern cameras do just fine with auto white balance in most situations. Area AF, or AF area. So we're just doing a single point autofocus. You'll see that when we go to take the picture. As far as our autofocus mode, we are doing single autofocus, so it's just going to autofocus once because we're not shooting anything that's moving. We don't need to do any sort of continuous autofocus, but we also have manual focus override on. So that's going to help us find out exactly how close we can get to our subject. And I'll show you guys that here in a little bit. Matrix metering, which will work just fine for this shot. It's not a big deal what kind of metering mode you go in, especially on a mirrorless, because you can see your exposure exactly and your exposure compensation. If you look up on top of the camera, up here, we're actually set to aperture priority mode. This will work fine in manual or aperture priority mode. It's just basically in manual, you're going to spin the wheel with your thumb. In aperture priority mode, it's going to be doing that for you. If we go down here to our settings, so aperture priority mode, like I just said, we are at, and so this is going to be automatic, our shutter speed, so we're not worried about that. The only thing that we're really worried about as far as exposures are ISO, which we already went over, and our aperture right here, which is f8. f8 is basically the sharpest overall aperture on this lens, and we're stopped down quite a bit since it's a kit lens and not a real macro lens where we're getting super close. We're going to get a pretty decent depth of field going down to f8. Alright, so let's go ahead and take our picture. So we're here, we got all our settings ready, we're on the tripod, we are ready to shoot. It's a little crooked, as you can see down there. Not a big deal. Not too worried about that, especially for this kind of shot, but I guess if I wanted to, I could straighten it out really quick. Yeah. Actually, I kind of like it about right there. So that's a little crooked, but that's how I want it. Now, as far as putting our focus point, you know, you don't want to do something too far away. You kind of want something close. Usually in general, just the general rule of thumb with photography, is that you don't want to focus on, you don't want anything usually out of focus in the foreground most of the time. It's a rule, and in photography, rules are meant to be broken. But this should work just fine. And we could actually do a depth of field preview here to see exactly what all is going to be in focus. So it looks like about halfway through the sand dollar there, it's actually going to come out of focus there a little bit. So a little bit of a blur, not a huge deal. It's going to make a pretty cool looking picture. If you want to get everything in focus, then you're going to need to shoot a little bit wider, stand further back, crop down more in post, or you're going to have to do some sort of stacking method. You could also stop down your lens even more than it is, but then you're going to start getting diffraction. It's really not going to look good. That's where focus stacking comes in handy. We're going to be doing that in a later video. So we're ready to shoot. Our focus is good. Nice focus. Let's go ahead and adjust our exposure before we shoot, because even though if we take a picture here, and let's go look in here, we can see that it's actually a pretty decent looking exposure. Nothing wrong with that. That should work just fine. But like always, if we want to get the most dynamic range out of our camera, if we want to get the best image quality we possibly can get, we are going to want to maximize our exposure. So you can see if we go too much, this the sand dollar here, we're starting to get our highlight warnings. So we definitely don't want that. So let's crank this down until those go away. And just to be safe, because I can see a few on the chain, I'm going to go, I think about plus 0.7 exposure. And now I'm going to go ahead and take, even though the highlights seem bright, we can take those down in post. So let's go ahead and take our picture. Okay, and that's it, guys. Now, I'm just going to show you really quick my setup here and what we're doing. That way you guys know. So for one, as far as the weather goes, let me get this off the tripod really quick. So as far as our weather goes, we actually got a fairly nice overcast. The sun, it is right up in those clouds right now. But I also have just some stuff here. I got the piece of wood that the chain was on. Let me go ahead and bring my exposure back up here really quick. Ooh, too much. So I got the piece of wood here that that our little chain and our sand dollars on, and then I have this old hot tub cover and that's shading us from any sun that might be coming through, but we also have that cloud behind it, so we have a nice even exposure here. If you're out in super harsh sun, and you can see that's why we were getting an 80th of a second even though we were outdoors. Between the shade, the overcast, and shooting down at f8, we were actually getting a pretty slow shutter speed for being outdoors. But in general, you just really don't want to be in the super harsh bright sunlight, although sometimes it can work. It's a rule. Rules are meant to be broken. Shade's good, but shade can also cause sometimes it can cause issues with bad looking color cast outside, especially if you're out in a wooded area. People's faces look green, so it's just, I could do a whole video about this that would be hours long, so we're not going to get into that today, but just for this shot I wanted to show you guys what I was doing. And as far as focusing, let me get over here really quick. This is what I was talking about, that manual focus override. Now this is set, I don't know if you guys can see it, you probably can't, but there's actually some focus peaking on here. And so you could use your focus peaking, or you can manually focus. The autofocus for this kind of stuff works just fine. It's a lot easier for beginners, but later on you could play with that focus peaking to get your plane of to get the plane of your depth of field exactly where you want it to get. But then the other thing that I'd highly recommend that you do is we're going to spin this all the way to the left, and when you're going to set up your shot, and you want to get it as close as you possibly can, right? We're doing a macro on a kit lens, so we want to get as zoomed in, as big as possible. So for one, we're shooting at 42 millimeters. I guess I should have mentioned that earlier, but better late than never. Hey guys, I was trying to show you this on the video I was making earlier. It's just getting kind of hard to do it with two cameras at once, so I'm just going to show you this using the video capabilities of my EM1 Mark II. But basically, if you want to get the closest shot that you can possibly get for these kind of macros, what you're going to want to do is go into manual or use some sort of manual override, and then you're going to get it to the closest, so whichever end gets you the closest focusing possible. So on Olympus, it usually means you spin it to the left. Now all I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly go forward until I get my chain here in focus. Now I can see that that's my closest focusing distance that I can get. And then what I like to do a lot of times, I like to just take a little step back and then switch it back to autofocus. That's a really easy way to do it, just in case you're off by a tiny bit. Don't be afraid to go a tiny bit back and then crop it later. Okay guys, before we get into the editing, there's a few things that I wanted to go over with you really quick, and that's how sensor size and maximum reproduction ratio plays into macro. Now one thing that I was talking about with the sensor size is you get that extra depth of field, which is nice, but there also is another huge advantage, and that is, and let me show you guys something here. You're going to see a lot of stuff, and you're going to hear a lot of things about one-to-one macro. Now this is the lens that I just shot with. This is not a one-to-one macro. This is a 1 to 5.26. If I was shooting with a 1-to-1 macro, let's say this 30 millimeter, or actually let's go with this. Here we go. Here's a 1-to-1 macro, 60 millimeter f2.8 Olympus macro. If I was shooting with that lens and I was as close as I possibly could get, what that means is basically I would be able to fill my frame completely with an object that's the size of the sensor. So basically something that's about 17.3 millimeters across, 13 millimeters high. So pretty small object. Now if I use a 1-to-1 macro on a full frame, that object is going to be a lot bigger. Now the full frame cameras like the A7R3 have more megapixels, so they can crop down to kind of make up for that. But you have to understand, with the micro 4/3 system, if that was scaled up to full frame, it would be an 80 megapixel system. So it's still, you're actually you know, at 1-to-1 on both of these, you're going to get more detail out of the 20 millimeter micro 4/3 than you will out of the Sony, you know, full frame A7R3. But with the EM1 Mark II that I own, I was talking about that 80 megapixel mode. I can shoot in 80 megapixels and then also get it smaller down while getting more megapixels. So it's just one reason I can't recommend the micro 4/3 format enough for this kind of work. There are some advantages to full frame, like if you were hand holding and you needed to crank your ISO, these are better in low light, or for some reason you needed more dynamic range, which usually isn't the case in macro, but if you did, then the full frame could be a better choice. And, you know, lens selection, you know, if you go with Nikon or Canon, you're going to have a lot more lenses to choose from, but micro 4/3 definitely has a lot of lenses that you can choose from. So let's go ahead and look at our lens here. So I wanted to show you guys this. So what does it mean if something has a 1 to 5.26 maximum reproduction ratio, like what we shot with today? Well, what that means is all you have to do is take 5.26, you're going to times that by these numbers. So let's just say we times that by 17.3, that's going to give us about 91 millimeters. And which means we're going to have about 3.6 inches. So if we fill the frame completely with that lens, whatever we're looking at, it's going to be about 3.6 inches across the top. So when you are shopping for your lenses, even if you're not shopping for a macro lens, if it's any lens that you might do some close-up work with, which I've done it with many different lenses, even when I buy something like a 24-70 or an equivalent of that, I still want a nice focusing distance, because if it can get really close, then when I'm doing something like shooting a wedding and I go to do the ring macro, I don't have to switch out lenses and get a macro lens, because if it has a decent maximum reproduction ratio, especially on a micro 4/3 small sensor, I can usually get enough magnification to do something like a ring shot and it'll still come out looking nice. Dedicated macro would be better, but it's nice to know that I could do this. Now let's go ahead and take a look at this, the Nikon AFP. This is one thing that I always liked about this lens, 1 to 2.63. That's crazy close. Most lenses do not get that close. So when you're shopping for your lenses, keep that in mind. Another thing you want to keep in mind is this minimum focus distance right here, 9.84 inches. Pay attention to that. That's going to be the distance, the closest you can get with that lens, but that's measured from your sensor to the subject. So that way you can kind of get an idea of how close you can get to your subject. So just wanted to go over that with you guys really quick, and gonna do just a quick rundown of some more macro gear. I know I talked about it a little bit. This is something you're gonna hear about a lot, is extension tubes. This is a Nikon brand extension tube. They want $90 for it. Now there's a couple different kinds. There's smart extension tubes, which transfer all your information from your lens to your camera. So they can make it to where you can control your aperture if it's a camera, or if it's a lens that you can't control the aperture on the lens. If you have to control it in the camera, a smart adapter will let you do that, and it can let you autofocus and do things like that. And then there's dumb adapters that don't have any electronic connections, which it looks like this doesn't have any. And what those do, the biggest issue with those, in my opinion, is that you can't change your aperture on a lot of these newer lenses. So I really don't like these. For the price of the good ones with the electronic contacts on it, I had a cheap one for Nikon and it didn't work. So I feel like you'd have to buy a good one if you wanted one that actually worked. And for the price of those, you could almost buy a macro lens. Maybe not the nicest one that you want, but you could probably buy a decent macro lens. My 30 millimeter f3.5 Olympus, that thing occasionally goes on sale for $100. And there's also cheap macro lenses for Nikon and almost any other brand, $200 or less. It's like, you know, take that $100, throw it towards an actual macro lens. You'll thank me. These are a pain to use. When you slap these on, they make it to where you can't focus really far, so it's not like you can leave them on there. You lose a lot of light. It's just a pain. I'm not a huge fan of those at all. But what I am a big fan of, and I have used these before, and I do have some for some of my other lenses, these are diopters. They're also known as macro filters, and you get a pack of 4 for $9. It's so cheap. You take a 10x diopter and you throw it on the Nikon 18-55 AFP, and that will make it a near 1-to-1 macro lens for dirt cheap. I think it makes it like 1-to-1.1 or 1-to-1.2. Super close. So really nice option. It's like $10, so why not? And unlike the extension tubes, this just goes on the end, so you can control your aperture, you have all your connections, your autofocus, all that stuff. I just find these to be way better. Plus, they cost nothing. It's $9. If you hate it, whatever. It's $9 down the drain. That's, you know, what your lunch cost yesterday. So check these out. They're really nice. And in my experience, even these cheap Vivitar ones that are literally like $2 a piece, these have worked great. And I didn't even notice that they were on there. I mean, it still had great image quality. So yeah, these are fantastic. Be sure to look at those if you just, you know, if you can't afford a macro lens, that's a great option. Now, if we are looking at actually buying a dedicated macro lens, which in my opinion is the best option because you could toss it on, you don't have to worry about screwing on a filter and all that, and it's just a lot easier. This is a favorite of mine. This is my 30 millimeter f3.5. And this is actually a 1.25 to 1, which is really cool. So it actually gets a little bit closer than 1 to 1. This is super compact. Great lens for the Olympus cameras. Now, one thing that, you know, there's a few different kinds of macro lenses out there. These shorter ones are usually cheaper. This one, you can find this on sale for like $100. They're usually cheaper. But there's some issues because this is really short. It's only 30 millimeters. That's pretty short. Because it's only 30 millimeters, the minimum focusing distance on this thing is almost to the edge of this. You're right there, and because of that, it's super hard to fit light in there to light your subject, and then also it can be difficult to do bugs because you get so close that you scare them away if it's a live bug. However, and some people say, oh, it's worthless because of that. That's not true. You can still, these are fantastic if you know how to use them. They can be a little bit trickier to use than a long lens, but because they're the shorter millimeter, you're getting a deeper depth of field. And you know, just like I've been showing you guys this whole video, that's the big thing, is fighting that depth of field. You know, you want to get as much as you possibly can, and this is a good way to do it. Plus, they're compact. You can carry them around. If you want to get something a little bit more serious, you know, they have I mean, there's a million different macro lens, but this is a longer macro, so you wouldn't have to get so close to bugs. You could fit lights in there. It's just a regular 1-to-1 macro. These are always a good solid option for your first go. There's a few other different kinds. Laowa makes some crazy wide angle 1-to-1 macros. Ultra wide, way wider than 30 millimeters. I think it's a 15 millimeter. It's for full frame, which is absolutely crazy. There's, what is it? Medicon Zhangyi. I don't know how you say that. There's another one, and that's actually, instead of a 1-to-1, it's something like a 4.5 to 1. So it's basically a microscope. And, you know, getting into Nikons, I know some really hardcore guys, they like the 200 millimeter. And I believe that's a 1-to-2 macro. It's not even a 1-to-1, but they like it because of the length and that they can fit lights in and not scare bugs easily. There's, you know, I'm not going to get too much into every single macro lens out there because there's a million of them, but these are your basic kinds. Just keep that in mind when you're shopping, that if it's a shorter one, you're going to have some trouble fitting lights in there. Another thing that you guys are going to want to look at when getting a just when you're getting into macro or landscapes or anything is a remote shutter. $8. They cost nothing. There's different kinds. You can spend a little bit more and get a wireless one. I got one of those. I got a wired one, and you can get ones with intervalometers that have a bunch of buttons and settings and a screen on there, and they can let you do time lapses if your camera won't do them, and all these other things. It's a good option. The reason why I brought this up is even though you can just use a timer like I did today, sometimes people like these a lot better because you don't have to wait 2 seconds every time you take a picture, especially if you're doing stacking and you're manually doing it. You don't have to keep waiting every single time. Also, when I shot with Nikon my D5300, when I put that in the 2-second timer, you take a picture and it takes it off, and you have to go in the menu and do it again every time. It's super annoying. So some cameras, this is just much more convenient. And just talk about tripods. Now, I'm not going to get too into tripods because there's a million different kinds, and it's like finding a pair of shoes. I can't tell you what kind of pair of shoes that you're going to like. Everybody's feet are different. Everybody has a different shoe size. You know, you might think something's comfortable, and then I don't think it's comfortable. However, just looking at a good basic tripod, some people say, oh, if you spend $100 or whatever, you can't get a good tripod. That's bull. My favorite tripod that's lasted me forever was like this cheap $90 tripod made by Slick, which is pretty good. But if I was to get a tripod right now, and I plan on getting something like this pretty soon, this looks pretty sweet. It's one of the highest rated tripods, one of the most popular tripods ever, and that's the MePhoto Road Trip Aluminum Travel Tripod. You can get it in a bunch of different colors. One thing that's really nice about it is that it has this archetype mount. Now, if you don't know what that is, that's basically like a universal mount, which is kind of cool because it just makes it really easy if you want to switch your camera between different tripods, and it is just so much more convenient than having a million different mounts and moving plates around from camera to camera and tripod to tripod. When you're new, that doesn't seem like a big deal because you have like one camera and one tripod, but once you start getting a few different ones, you're going to wish that you would have first invested in a universal mount. The tripod that I used today that you guys saw that the EM10 was on was this cheap Amazon Basics tripod that I just bought for $15 because I wanted to put cell phones on it, and it's a total piece of junk. It's like the cheapest thing. I'd spend a little bit of money. I'd get something like this. You don't want to go too cheap on your tripod. I would not trust that thing to, hold its ground. It'd probably fall over, but this is a nice little tripod, but you might have to get something that's a little bit bigger if you have a bigger camera. If this can't hold the weight of your gear. This also turns into a monopod, which is pretty cool. But yeah, check this out if you're not sure. Some people like bigger ones, smaller ones, different heights or whatever. But this looks like a pretty good all-around tripod. Hopefully, I'll get one pretty soon and test that out for you guys. Getting into lights now, this is a huge thing. Like I was talking about, when you're shooting macro, you're stopping down, you're doing all that stuff. One thing that could really help is having a good light, especially if you're hand holding. It's going to let you get that shutter speed up, or you could use it to just light your subject better. Maybe you have ugly indoor ambient light on it and you want some good looking flash on there instead. Look at getting some lights for your macro work. This right here, this is really expensive, but there's some cheaper ones. That's because this is a Canon brand right here. And this is just a twin flash, so just a regular flash that you'd put, except for it outputs to two little flashes. You can see this ring right here. This just goes on your lens with different adapters, and you're going to see quite a few other things like that. This right here, this is the same kind of thing, except for it's just a ring. The light's a ring instead of two little flashes on the side, but that's another flash. There are some other options. You look at this crazy looking thing. This is just a diffuser, and it's really cheap. It's only, what is it, $24. And you regular flash, so you don't have to buy a whole nother flash. You could slap this on. As you can see, it's kind of bulky, but some people like this stuff. There's plastic ones. There's a few different style of these things that you could use as a ring light to be able to get your light in there. This is another flash, and this one just, the arms are flexible. Now I really like these flexible arms. Same on this one. I actually own one that's pretty much exactly like this. When you're using the really short macros, like I was saying earlier, like that 30 millimeter 3.5, you're going to want something like this to get in there. These are great for getting in on those shorter macros. Some of these rings you can't, especially something like this, no way, but also stuff like this, it's harder to get in there, and a lot of times, especially for the Olympus, a lot of these you can't even fit them on there because the lens is too small. So, and this is actually an LED instead of a flash, so they're usually cheaper, but you don't get as much power, but you can also use constant light, which is nice, so you don't have to flash every time. So these can be great for doing automatic focus bracketing and stacking. We'll get into that later on the next macro video that we do. But yeah, this is really these are really nice. You just don't get as much light. They can flash, but it's not the same as a regular flash. Let's go ahead. And this is the same thing as the last one I showed you, but it's just in the ring format. So but it's an LED versus a flash like the other ring that I showed you. And of course, you can always just take a regular flash or just any kind of light. You can use a flashlight if you want. There's all sorts of different ways to light them. I've seen people just, you could bounce off a ceiling. You could put a diffuser on your flash and just hold it above whatever you're shooting. There's quite a few different ways to go about it. And let me show you one more thing here I forgot to bring up. These are 5-in-1 reflectors. Now you might think, what are we going to use this for macro? These can actually be really handy for doing macro outdoors. And basically you're just using it for the diffuser mostly. So what these do is it's like a little pouch, and inside's a diffuser. You could see that in the middle right here where my mouse is. And if you got that harsh sunlight, like I was saying earlier, you could hold this up, take your shot, and that's going to take that harsh sunlight. Still going to let some through, so it's not going to be like if you shade it, you're going to get that nice looking sun on there. And this is a huge thing. A lot of professional photographers like Jason Lanier, when he does portraits, he uses a diffuser to get rid of that harsh sunlight and turn it into really nice sunlight. So even, this stuff is great for macros and portraits and all sorts of other outdoor natural light work. So if you are looking at getting into macro photography, check out some of this gear, and I hope that helps you guys out. Okay guys, let's go ahead and edit these bad boys. So one of the first things that I'm going to do, and part of this series, is I just really want to help out new photographers. So if I'm editing it in a $300 piece of software like Capture One, Pro 11, that's kind of unrealistic considering there's probably some new photographers that paid that much, maybe even less, for their camera. So I'm not going to suggest, and I'm not going to edit these in a program that they can't even afford. So what we're going to do is we are going to edit these just using the Windows Photo Viewer, which actually works great for raw images. The only issue is that it doesn't support the Olympus files and a couple other brands. So what you have to do is you have to convert them to DNG, and then that will let you use them. So I talked about this on my last video, the DNG converter. This is really simple. I already merged them, but all you do is you go here, you select your folder, and you just select the folder with the images that you want to convert into a DNG. Select location to save and convert image. Save in new location. So you can save in the same location or a new location. I do a new location. Select the folder, and then you can go ahead and pick it. It's real nice and easy. All you do is you hit convert after that, and then you're done. So let's go ahead and edit these. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the image. It's going to pop it up here in Windows, and the stuff that I'm going to show you, a lot of this is going to translate right over to other programs. I'm just using Windows, but we could check focus here. As you can see, the front part of this got a nice focus, as well as some of the sand dollar. This is kind of more of a artistic shot where we got you know, kind of shallow depth of field, and you could see even at f8, even with a kit lens, even on a micro four thirds camera, when you get to these closer focal distance, you still have a razor thin depth of field. And that's kind of why I didn't want to shoot something, I didn't want to shoot this flat. I wanted some depth so that way you guys could really see what the depth of field looks like. Now, if you really wanted to get this whole thing in focus, which probably would look a little bit better, at least a little bit more, then you do focus bracketing or focus stacking. So you could do one where this area is in focus, and then one where this is in focus, and one like we have right here. You can stack those together and you'll get a deeper depth of field without having to stop down or without having to go back. I could have gone back and just cropped it out, but then we're getting a file that doesn't have a lot of detail in it. So it's just kind of a creative choice on what you guys want to do. If you want to go with that shallower depth of field, if you want to spend the time to stack your images. But the first thing, before you really get into any of that stuff, just learn the basics first. Learn how to do a good shot like this. And if you guys look down in the description below, I'm going to have a link to my blog. I'm going to have a couple of my favorite macro shots that I've done with a kit lens. So we got this popped up. Let's go ahead and go to edit and create, and then we click edit. And we are here in the editor. We'll go full screen. And you have some, you could do some filters, you know, it's really, and a lot of these don't really even look that bad like this. But just for this video, we're not going to be doing any of that. Same with this, you can do an auto enhance, and like I said in my last video, it actually does a pretty good job. I mean, I'd be pretty satisfied with just that. But when it comes to adjusting these, you see we were overexposed a little bit. We did that on purpose so we could maximize the detail. With light that's this even, that's not a humongous deal. It's a good skill to learn anyways for other forms of photography. Not a huge deal when your lighting's this even, but you might as well. You could always just bring it down in post, which we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and bring that down just a little bit. Contrast, well, it depends. You can go, neither of these really look bad. If you go negative contrast, it gives you kind of a dreamier look. If you increase it, it kind of gives you a more dramatic look. I'd just increase that. And if you go too far in one way or the other, it just starts to look really goofy. So, you know, just the general rule of thumb when you guys are editing, especially if you're new, don't try and run before you can walk. Just do the basics. Go real easy on those sliders. A lot of times, if you're shooting properly, you got some decent gear, it's going to look pretty great out of camera, and you don't need to do a whole lot depending on your kind of picture and what you're going for. Don't get into crazy editing right off the bat. Learn how to do some basic editing first and then get into that. But yeah, we'll just increase the contrast. There's the exposure. Now the highlights, we can actually bring them down. And this will start to bring, even though our highlights were a little blown because we overexposed outside, we can bring them down, and that's going to even it up a little bit. So let's bring those down a little bit. Our shadows, we can bring them up, and this is going to give it kind of that HDR kind of look to it, to where, you know, our highlights are down, our shadows are up, really even, dramatic tone to the picture. Let's go down here to color. So we could change the warmth if we want to warm it up a little bit. I don't necessarily oppose that. We have tint here, and it's probably going to be pretty good right out of camera if you shoot white balance. If you shoot without a white balance on, you could change it here if it looks a little bit off. It's generally what these are, is color corrections. Usually I don't adjust tint just for artistic purposes, but I will sometimes warm up or cool down a picture a little bit. It's really up to you guys. Just don't go too crazy with either of these unless you're trying to fix your image because for some reason the white balance was off. And we have our saturation here, and I wouldn't mind actually going down a tiny bit because it just at 0 it kind of looks a little, especially over here, looks really green and yellowish. With this basic program, I'd just adjust those colors, but I can't with this program because it's pretty basic. I have to adjust all the colors at once or just do the tint and the warmth. But for these basic edits, it'll be fine. The vignetting, one thing that, you know, like I was saying earlier, just in my personal opinion, of course this is all subjective, but in my opinion, especially if you're a beginner, for one, don't go with a negative vignette. I mean, you can, it's up to you, but a lot of times it just looks goofy to me. Some people like it. I'm not a huge fan. I've never been a huge fan of it. I wouldn't worry about that stuff when you're new. Worry about that stuff once you learn how to get a good image first. And the same, you know, I'd either keep it where it's shot, but I like to go a little bit dark. And what that's going to do, that's going to darken up around the edges, and it's going to pull your attention to the center of the picture. And just, you know, like I don't like the white vignette. It also to me looks kind of goofy when people go too far to the dark end, and it just, you know, looks like this real cheesy vignette. If you do it just a little bit, it really kind of, I like it to where people don't know there's a vignette, but what it's doing is that it's pulling their attention to the center of the image. But that's pretty much it. Let's go ahead and crop this a little bit. And, you know, the crop, that's just going to be, let's actually put this in a 16:9 aspect ratio. Now, it's kind of a weird aspect ratio to use. I like it a lot because it's going to fill your computer screen up corner to corner, but not really a big deal. Whatever aspect ratio you want. Just in general, I would just, again, don't do anything crazy. Let me go ahead and free this up. I wouldn't do anything real crazy. Like, I wouldn't do something like this. That's going to look goofy, you know. And in general, what I like to do and what I recommend for beginners is to go with a, you know, like a wider aspect ratio, or not a wider aspect ratio, but I generally, I like it when the image is wider than it is tall. It's pleasing to the eye. Of course, you could do verticals, square. Sometimes I like square, but it's kind of weird looking. It's also could be how, you know, what kind of program you're going to load it up in. Like there's some programs where it only lets you load square images for your profile picture or whatever, you know, the social media programs. But for this one, I'm just going to go with the 16:9. I'm going to crop it down a little bit, but not that much. Let's get this up here. I would just go about right there, and then we can kind of straighten this out a little bit. One thing is when you're straightened, you can just look at, you know, stuff like the grain here and try and get that squared up. Usually kind of is a little bit more pleasing to the eye, but we're going to go and click done, and that is it. This picture is completed. Hope you guys like this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, enable notification, and comment down below. If you'd like to support this channel so I can make future content, check out my website, boldlensphotography.com, where I sell fine art prints. You can also donate money at patreon.com/boldlensphotography. And I'll have links below to all my social media accounts. And hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time. Bye.